Hi, I'm Audra. My master's program was the first time that I was introduced to statistics, and like most students, I was intimidated by it and had put it off until the very last moment. I was a dedicated qualitative researcher because I don't like math. About 20 years on, and about 95% of my research is quantitative, but I still really don't like math. I was lucky in this first stats class because my professor helped us to see that statistics in a social science context is about logic and reasoning with numbers and not doing the math itself. That's what we have programs like SPSS, SAS, or even Excel for. However, there are still the practicalities of actually having to run and interpret the stats. So what I'm hoping to do in this 7-part podcast series is introduce you to the data analysis process to demystify it and get you through your first project. I'll be introducing you to the basics of analysis in SPSS because it's the one that I use and it seems the most readily available for most folks. There are, however, two assumptions that we need to make before we move forward. First is that you're already familiar with research methods. This podcast series isn't about teaching you what research methods are or how to approach research. You really should already know that before you start watching these. Second, you have a data set that you're trying to work with. This series is designed so that you watch some podcast material, then you try it yourself, even pausing a few places as you go along. So let's move into the first installment in our series, familiarizing yourself with your data file. In this podcast, we're going to start as if you've just downloaded your data for the first time, and we'll walk through a few of the things that you can and should be doing to set your data file up for analysis. Now, most of these days, data is certainly collected online. If however, you actually have the old-fashioned pen and paper surveys, then you'll need to get those entered into SPSS. However, this podcast should also help you as you're setting up your data file for the first time. Alright, here's the folder that I've set up for our data analysis. The more organized you can be, the better off you'll be. So let's start by opening up our freshly downloaded data SPSS file. What you'll notice is that SPSS always opens up two files. One's your output file and the other is your data file. So the output file logs everything that you do to your data. In these early stages, it's not necessary to save it, but you don't need to bother closing it because each time you do something, it'll just reopen again. So let's minimize the output file because we won't be looking at it in this podcast. Now we're left with our other file, and that is the data file. Now, if you look at the bottom left, you'll notice that there are two views, the data view and the variable view. So if we take a look to start with at the variable view, this is the list of questions and key information about each of the variables. If you want to see the actual spreadsheet of the data, then you click over to the data view. Each respondent is on a row. Your variables are in the columns. If you've entered your data by hand, one trick to make sure that you don't have some data entry errors is to take a look at the View menu and then to click on the box called Value Labels. Then as you scroll across your data, you can see any response categories that you've designated. It's a nice double check to see for yourself as you go through the categories. So, gender, for instance, with male and female. Now, before you do anything with your data, my suggestion is to save it under a different name. There are lots of ways that you can kind of screw up your data file, and you don't want to find yourself in the position where you lose data that you can't recover, or at least can't recover very easily. So the best practice as you start to do anything with your data is to save multiple versions. Let's do that now. You'll notice that I called this file my downloaded data file. I'm going to save it now as raw clean. So I keep the demonstration bit and I just change it to raw cleaned. because this tells me that I don't have anything advanced done with it. I'm just working on the cleaned up file. So if you're working on your data as you go, take a pause and save your data now as a different file or a different version. But now let's come back to our variable view and get to work with our data. Just a quick side note, in SPSS, when we talk about variable view, what SPSS means is that it's your list of questions. This isn't necessarily the same thing as all the scales that you might have collected or even your test variables. So let's take a quick peek at what you see in your variable view. Starting at the left and working on to the right along the columns, let's take a look through each of these. The first one, the name column, is the short name that you see listed in the columns in your data view. So for example, V's 1 through 10, V 1 through 10. This gives it a nice, quick, clean name that you can refer to if you're in your data. You can leave it alone as just your question numbers, or you can give it something more descriptive. That's up to you. I always change them because I'm a bit compulsive. So if you want to change the name, all you need to do is to click on the row under the name you want to retype, just like this. Let's go to age. And we just type AGE. Now, the second column tells you what kind of a variable it is. Unless you have a question where you've asked your respondents to type in a response, what you really want is for all of your types to say numeric. Because in most tests in SPSS, it doesn't really know what to do if it's not numeric. The numeric tells it that it's a number to be dealing with. So let's say that we wanted to change our age, which is listed as a string variable because we asked them to type it in. Let's say that we want to change that to a numeric. All you do is you click on the right side of the cell and you get this option that pops up. Now, don't worry about all the stuff in the middle. We're not interested in it for data beginning data analysis. Just click it to numeric. Now the other thing you can do right here is to change the width so that it's uniform with the rest. The rest of your columns are 8 characters wide. If you want to be consistent with that, you would change that highlighting there, change it, and hit OK. Now the other way to change the width, if you wanted, is to actually go to our third column over and to choose the width. And so you can do it one number at a time by clicking the arrows down and up. If you're going from 2000 to 8, not terribly helpful. You can also just highlight it and enter in the value. Again, this just keeps your data uniform in your data view, but it doesn't really affect anything. The fourth column are your decimals. Again, this is just something that is shown in the data view. You can leave this column as it is. It doesn't change any of your calculations, it's just what's visible. The next column, though, is actually important. This is the label. So when you run any of your statistical tests, this is the description that will be in your output. You want this to be as clear and descriptive of what the question is about, but also brief so that it's easy to read in your output, as well as in any of the changes, any of the tests boxes that you run in SPSS, it's the label that pops up. So first, let's expand the column so that it's easier to see. Go up to the top, get the sideways arrow, and then just slide the column over. Now, let's say that you wanted to totally change the column. So if we look at line 16, that's really talking about gender. Do you identify as, was how the question was framed to them. If you want to change everything in the box, you do a single click and you put in your new name, and it just types over. But maybe you wanted to change just part of it, so you double click in the box, and then you can edit, you can change, you can do whatever it is that you want in the box with your editing to get it to be how you want it to look. So either way of editing your box, as you go through and you change your labels, it gives us more space to do what to see what we're really working on, it clarifies them, and it just makes it a lot easier. When I'm setting up my labels, I like to be very descriptive because then if I'm working with someone, they can open up my data file and know exactly what they're looking at. Or, more often than not, when I come back to the data a couple of months or even a year or two later, the file is easy to work with. It takes a little time, but it's worth a few hours to have the data file set up well. Now, before you go off and edit all your labels, let's finish going through the columns and then clean up your variables. The next variable are the values. These are also important. So if you've asked someone whether they're male or female, it gets entered into the data file as a 1 or a 2. But unless you want to go back to your original questionnaire to figure out whether a 1 is male or female, you want to make sure that your values themselves are quite clear. So, fortunately, a lot of the virtual data sites like Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey provide a lot of the labels for your categorical data for you. However, it's still worth taking a look at them. So, again, to verify or change the labels themselves, you click on the right side of the particular cell, and this box pops up. Let's say that you wanted to relabel them from what people saw in the survey. So you would highlight the row that you wanted to change. Then you change your label or your value. Be sure to click change, and it does. You do the same thing. Let's be consistent here. You change it, and when you're finished, you click OK. Now, in a lot of cases, it might be that there are none. Let's say you had a scale, and you wanted a little bit more clarity put on your scale from 1 to 5 or whatever it might be. If you wanted to do that, you do the same process, except here you're just putting in, meaning 1, and you hit tab or click the box, and you hit, oh, it's a string. It's a date. I need to get a different variable, sheesh. Let's click on a numeric one. And this is why we want our data to be all consistent. So you go 1, meaning 1, and you add. Then you go 2, meaning 3, whatever labels that you wanted, and you would click OK. Now, it might be that you want to use the same labels for several. Instead of typing them all over, you can right-click and copy or Control-C, and then you go to your next one that you would like to change, and you hit Control-V or paste with a right-click. And you can change any of them that you want by doing it that way. So you want to make sure that your labels are clear. And so just a shortcut or a tip, let's say you've typed in the value labels, you just do it with the multiple Control-C, Control-Vs. So then the last column that you need to pay any attention to is the missing one. You might have questions that people chose not to answer, like income, or particular questions in the survey you didn't mind if they skipped. You might have a few people who, for example, completed most of the survey, so their information, their data was good, but maybe they just didn't finish it. SPSS automatically counts empty cells as missing data. And so if that's how it's entered into the system, like you have done nothing else to it, it just shows up as a period in your data view. If that's how you want to leave it, then you don't need to change anything. It doesn't get counted as you run your tests. It's simply there as system missing. However, let's say that you needed to mark a particular response as missing, or you wanted particular value labels. This is where you want to change that. So again, making sure that it's for the numeric data, then you click in, and let's say you wanted to have the number 9. Any entry that was listed as number 9, you want it to be counted as missing, so that in your analyses, the program just ignored it. You enter those, and you can enter up to 3 of them into the missing values, and you click OK. And just the same as you did if you're changing the values on your data, if you want to have multiple columns with the same missing, you just hit paste with that, or you do the Control V option. So you can set up your missing there. It's an easy way so that you tell the program what data that you want to ignore and how you want it to ignore it. Now, the rest of these columns don't really matter. So we can ignore everything else to the right. It doesn't really change anything in running your data. Feel free to explore them if you like. They're just not necessary. Okay, so you've seen how to edit the columns, but now let's talk about cleaning up your data. If you've downloaded your data, you'll probably notice that there's a bunch of data captured that you don't necessarily want or need. This data happened to be collected in Qualtrics, but others like SurveyMonkey and the like all have similar kinds of information that they capture. So the first thing to do is to get rid of unnecessary variables. So this is our first step in cleaning up your data file, is to go through and take out any unnecessary variables. Let's take a look at a few in this data set. All of these variables labeled V1 through 10 is information that the online server has captured, but that I don't want or need. So to get rid of them, you would just click on the row number and you hit delete. If you want to make it a little bit quicker, you hold down the control button and you highlight anything that you don't want to keep, anything that's irrelevant information. So I'm trying to get down, the first question I actually asked was about gender. So I can get rid of all of these at once. Now, make sure that as you do this for every little group that you get rid of or any little set of changes that you make, you save early and save often. If you do this, then if something happens, you delete one too many, you make a mistake, it's easy to recover because you've saved it at various points. Instead of creating like 100 different versions, you can keep it with minimal different versions, but when you save early, save often, you could just cancel out if there was a change you wanted to make but you didn't want to save. So, it's a really good idea to save these versions, but you want to keep it to about saving every 5 to 10 minutes. That way you can exit without saving and you don't lose a lot of time and space. Now, this is a good place to pause and for you to take the chance to get rid of any unnecessary variables in your file. The next thing we want to do is to go back to the data view, because we want to clean out responses that don't give us any information. Here's what I mean by this. Let's say that you've sent the link out to your questionnaire and requested that people participate. Anyone who clicked on the link is likely to be recorded as a participant, regardless of whether they completed the questionnaire or not. Sometimes people even get just a few questions in and they just can't be bothered. You don't want to capture responses that don't give you any or enough viable data to work with. The easiest way to spot check for viable data is to go to your first major question, and in our case it's gender, and sort the responses out. So you go up to your column header here, and then you right click on that header. That will give you this pop-up box, and so you select the option for Sort Ascending. In our case, there were 3 people who clicked onto the questionnaire but never completed anything about it. So we follow the same process for deleting the variables as we did when we were in the variable view. We go over to the left and we click on our row numbers that we want to get rid of. We hit the delete button and they're gone. And then again, we save. So this is why we have multiple versions of our files and why we do the save early, save often. Another file cleanup task that you may need to do is to assign particular missing values to your data. You might have a question or a series of questions where respondents could check none, check one, or check multiple answers. SPSS records those answers that weren't checked as being empty or missing. So you'll just see a period in the box. Let's take a look at one of these areas of questions in this questionnaire. And right here we have some. So in this case, respondents were asked to choose one. So we have one option from question 32 to question 39, but the rest are left empty. But if we want that to be a variable, it has to vary. So if we ran our data analysis and we were trying to compare those, it would show up as though there wasn't any variance in these questions. So we would want to recode so that it reflected not selected versus selected. Now, this is one case that you may want to change the values of the data. You may also want to do it if there was something missing. So again, you have genuinely a question that someone skipped. Now, you could do this by going through and cell by cell, entering the response that you wanted. Not only is this painfully time intensive, but you introduce a lot more potential for making a mistake in data entry, and so adding error and spending more time cleaning it up later on. The easier way to do this is to follow a procedure where you recode it into the same variable. So, again, for example, many respondents are a little uncomfortable providing personal details, or you have the multiple responses, but you want to note that this is more than just system missing. It was a response or a choice not to respond. So how do we do this? How do you recode your data into the same variable? Well, you start by going up here to the Transform menu. If you click that, then you come down to the Recode into Same Variables. Once you click that, you get the pop-up box with all of the variables or the questions in your survey in the left-hand column. So if you scroll down, we're looking for questions 32 through 39. Now, we do our control click so that we select multiple. And once we have all of the ones selected that we want, you choose this little middle arrow. They come over to the right-hand column. Once you have all of the variables in that you want to recode in the same way, you select old and new values. Now, in this case, because we were wanting to change it from a system missing to an actual number that would indicate it, we have our old and we have our new value areas. Old value, we start with system missing. And then we want to change that to a 1. And so we would add that. And so it shows you right here what the old one was and what it's going to be. So you'll have noticed in the data, though, that if they chose the option, it was already labeled a 1. Obviously, we can't have everything listed as 1, so we need to go back through and change that as well. So you go back to our left side, and you click the radio button for value, you press 1, and then you change it to 2 on this side, and you click Add, old value 1, new value 2. You could have made the not selected option 2, however, most of the time it's easier when you start running your analyses if the higher number is also the selected one. Now, all you have to do is to select continue, or if you wanted to have different kinds of values added in, if you had more than that, you can make and change as many as you want. But so what you do when you're all finished is you hit continue, and then you come back and you hit OK. Your output file pops up, minimize that again, and you can see that all of those that were empty now have 1 in it. All of those had the 1 are now the 2. Now, the other thing you're going to want to do is go back into your variable view and change the labels so that all of the labels are very clear. This makes sure that you keep organized and makes it easy to understand. Now, you'd follow the same procedure if you're wanting to change something into a missing value. So if you have the missing data, so for example, people who didn't want to include their income, for instance, or even their age, you want to record their data because the rest of their answers on the questionnaire are valuable. It's just that one or a few questions that people answer. You'd follow the same procedure, but it's customary to assign a 999 or 999 to that data to note it as missing. You would go into your variable view and you would make sure that that's all corresponding. That way the computer knows that if it sees 999 or 999, it treats it as missing. Recoding into the same variable is useful in a lot of instances, like this if you're wanting to change numbers that have been already assigned. Add the missing values. It's also useful if you have questions that need to be reverse coded. You would follow the same procedure. So if you had a scale from 1 to 5 and you wanted everything flipped around, a 1 becomes a 5, a 2 becomes a 4, and so on, you would follow the exact same process of entering in the old and the new value for each of the variables that you had wanted to change. Remember, each time you do this, make sure to save your file. Once you've cleaned up your data, you're ready to start doing stuff with it. However, that doesn't mean that you're ready to start answering your research questions or testing your hypotheses. So join me in the second podcast where we talk about step 2 in your process, running factor analyses.